Hi everybody, and welcome to Now and Men, the podcast on changing masculinities and challenging norms. I'm Stephen Burrell, and I'm here with my co-host, Sandy Rexton. How are things with you, Sandy?
Yes, hi everyone. I'm fine, thank you, Stephen. I should apologise really, there's been a bit of a gap since our last episode, and that's because I've been moving house. And I currently don't have Wi-Fi in my current house, so I'm at a friend's house, Nikki van der Gaag, and Nikki was the second ever guest on our podcast, so thanks to her for donating this space for this morning.
Yes, and we would encourage people to go back and listen to our episode with Nikki if you haven't done so yet. I'm visiting the UK myself at the moment, and I've been enjoying following the Men's Football World Cup, as long as it's not being, tampered with by governments or footballing authorities who seem to have a habit of ruining these things. But but I've also been enjoying following the how the kind of right-wing politician Nigel Farage has given up his seat and is yet recontesting it in a by-election, and is the only person challenging him is somebody called Count Binface. So if you're not familiar with UK politics, I can recommend checking that out if you want to laugh. But I'm very excited to have with us today Dr Judy Y Chu, whose work has had a bigger impact on me personally. And Judy is an educator and researcher whose work examines boys' gender socialization, their relationships and development, especially during early childhood and adolescence. And she's the author of an excellent book called When Boys Become Boys, and has also, for example, recently contributed a chapter on boys' social and emotional development to the Oxford Handbook on Masculinities and Mental Health, which is scheduled for release later this year.
And for over 20 years, Judy taught a course on boys' psychosocial development at Stanford University. She's also served in advisory roles for non-profit organisations including Movember, Equimundo, Roots of Empathy, Build Up Boys, the Foundation for Positive Masculinity, and the American Psychological Association's Task Force on Supporting Boys in Schools. She's currently based in Singapore, which is where she's joining us from today. So, hi Judy, and thanks very much for coming on the show.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
So, a vital contribution of your research has been in illustrating that despite the stereotypes at a young age, many boys show significant relational capacities such as empathy for others, emotional sensitivity, articulacy, attentiveness. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. It's actually very consistent with what researchers who studied infants found. So it's nothing new, and it's definitely not something that I introduced to the field, but it's just consistent with their findings that as human beings, most of us are born into relationships and with a fundamental capacity and a primary desire to connect with other people. I mean, we need it to survive during infancy and childhood, and we need it to thrive throughout the lifespan. And so at every age, having the ability to be emotionally attuned, to relate to other people, I mean, these are all things that serve us very well. And so in a way, when I saw this in boys, it was only surprising because it hadn't been much represented in the literature on boys. I mean, it was always kind of gendered feminine and expected, something that girls and women do, but not really linked to boys and men. But of course, when you think about it, or anyone who knows a boy or man or is a boy or man knows that boys, of course, have emotions, of course, have feelings and a desire to connect with other people in mutual and meaningful ways. And so a lot of what I did was just to document how we see these when we pay attention to it. And it's just those relational capacities or capabilities are something that tend to get overlooked and underrepresented in the academic literature as well as popular discourse in boys' everyday lives, but they're absolutely there, and they're really important and essential to their ability to navigate their way through the world successfully and effectively.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think I'm right to say that you've also found that as boys start to grow older, they learn what they have to do to fit in with being a man, in inverted commas, and these capabilities start to be suppressed. And how does that happen? What processes are going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. As a part of their gender socialization, which I describe as kind of the introduction to culturally specific messages about masculinity, what it means to be a real man or a real boy, and also pressures to conform to kind of cultural and group norms around masculinity. So like there's gender policing, like when boys deviate from conventions of masculinity or norms of masculine behavior. And so the things that they learn, that boys learn they're supposed to do and what they are and are not supposed to express in order to prove their masculinity, which is another aspect of it, that just the fear, the sheer fact that they have to prove their masculinity kind of sets them up to, first of all, be uncomfortable in their own skin because they have to somehow become something else or something more in order to feel worthy or to prove their masculine worth and to feel like they're deserving of love. And then secondly, I mean, it kind of calls on them to really kind of cover up certain aspects of their humanity. Like, again, these relational capabilities, because part of proving masculinity is not only aligning with masculine norms, but because in our cultures we so often define masculinity and femininity as mutually exclusive opposites, then proving masculinity becomes largely about distancing oneself or showing that one is not feminine. So showing that you're a boy involves showing that you're not a girl, or showing that you're a man involves showing that you're not a woman. And then of course we have our culture and society assigns values to that. So if you can be masculine and man up and be all those things that, society associates with men having honor and deserving status and being powerful, and then the kind of devaluing, the systemic devaluing of femininity, being like, oh, well, that's soft and that's weak, and that's, again, okay for women and girls to do it at best. But for men and boys, it becomes a liability because it becomes something that can kind of call them out of what people have come to call the man box, right? And so if you are not, again, showing that you are a real boy or man, you put yourself sometimes at personal risk, as in terms of physical safety. People can tease you, they can exclude you, they can unfortunately bully you, or worse, based on this kind of what my students call it is a trap. But it's kind of based on a system of societal expectations saying, first of all, you have to prove yourself. This is how you prove it. And then when you step outside of that box, when you fail to prove yourself in the ways that we prescribe, then we can legitimately punish you, and either socially or relationally, or in terms of your status and your legitimacy as a masculine person.
Yeah, and I guess if the current situation was so natural, then why would it cause so much pain to so many men, I suppose, right? And I suppose on that note, could you say a bit about anything you found in terms of what kinds of impacts does it have on boys and men, that they have to learn to suppress these, huge parts of themselves, I suppose?
Well, Stephen, I think you make a great point. I mean, if it were natural, then we wouldn't need gender policing, right? We wouldn't need to punish boys and men who somehow deviate from these norms. If it was actually how they wanted to be, they would just be it, and so we wouldn't need to reinforce and all those things. But in terms of, and that's exactly where the impact comes in, because it's not, I really don't believe that it's about telling boys how to be. Right. And I think that's where they struggle. It's like, and also it's not simply about, I mean, I know that there's a lot of concern about some messages about masculinity that are harmful, right? And then, obviously, if it's causing them harm to themselves or to harm other people, we definitely want to challenge and replace those. But kind of making progress is not simply about replacing one list of externally imposed expectations with another list, right? We're not saying like, oh, instead of being macho, go be sensitive or something, because it's really about what feels true and authentic and whole to them. And so some boys may be more shy, right? And so telling them that they have to that they have to talk about their feelings all the time, I mean, that might not feel natural to them. And so and again, it's more of an individual difference, because some boys may be very outspoken and want and not mind this. So it's really about kind of I think the impact comes when boys feel like they can't value all of everything about themselves, like who they are, the full range of their humanity, when they're led to feel shame for feeling sadness or fear or anything that they're told is not a manly emotion or thought to have. And then, kind of that the kind of repercussions of having to present yourself or posture in a way that doesn't reflect who you are, that not only hurts, it causes men and boys to have to kind of compartmentalize or kind of break off from parts of themselves, but it also makes it very difficult, if not impossible, for them to feel known and understood by someone else, which is, and as we now know, so important. Those kinds of relationships, close relationships that feel mutual and trusting and supportive, are so important to well-being. And so that places boys and men at a disadvantage in a world where everything is getting harder. No one can go it alone. And if they can't lean on other people because it's seen as a girly or feminine or somehow weak thing to do, that it leads to all sorts of problems, everything from loneliness and social isolation to anxiety, depression, and all the things that we wouldn't wish on anyone, but which are increasingly prominent.
Yeah, I mean, you were listing some emotions there. I was also thinking about joy. I mean, I feel like even expressions of joy aren't necessarily seen as very manly. But
Absolutely.
Yeah, and just building on what you were saying, I guess a key insight from your work, and also I think you've worked, for example, with Carol Gilligan, who's done amazing research with girls as well around this. It has this really important insight, this kind of tragic irony, really, that I suppose in order to try and fit in and have relationships with others in the process, we have to actually learn to, push down many of the things that actually make relationships so important and so meaningful in the first place, I guess.
Absolutely. And I love that you mentioned joy, because I think that's absolutely true. I mean, it's kind of like this, when boys, in an effort to kind of appear nonchalant, I think that was one of the words that was recently trending that my students told me about. And it was funny because she's like, that's the student that brought it up says, so I don't know what they're supposed to be, like chalant. And I just thought that was a really funny twist on it. But joy, absolutely. I saw that with the 4-year-olds. Someone would come in, a special guest or something, brought animals to the classroom, and their kids are, of course, totally excited. And this one boy starts jumping up and down because he just can't wait. Yeah. And the other boys are like, and they literally said, shut up. And he didn't say anything, but what they meant was to tamp that down. Like you can't experience that exuberance. That is actually when Carol and I spoke to the boys' fathers and met with them, and Carol asked this wonderful question of what do you see in your boys at this age that makes you think, I hope he never loses that? And the fathers spoke about, exactly that, the boys' joy, their exuberance, their pleasure in each other's company, how they love their friends, how they would get really excited, about everything. And that's something that's seen as this is not a word anymore, I guess, but I use it, but not cool. You have to kind of just make sure you just don't really care, whatever, you have to just not care. And so I think one of the things that boys perceive is that they don't have permission to care, to care about things, to care about people. Everything has to kind of be well, whatever, I'll take it or leave it. I don't need this. I don't need that. I don't need these people. If my best friend doesn't want to be my best friend anymore, whatever. And that it's just this dulling and this kind of numbing that of course doesn't serve them well, and it doesn't make them feel good. And so it's really a heartbreaking loss to see, because they do go from feeling everything really fully to feeling like they have to really be in control all the time, which again is asking kind of them to be inhuman in some ways, because we all need to feel. And then we know that when we suppress those emotions, it doesn't make them go away. They don't somehow dissipate, but they actually, can become troublesome if they're negative emotions that really need to be dealt with and addressed and acknowledged and discussed. So.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, do you think is it possible to kind of relearn and reconnect with these parts of ourselves, once they start to become suppressed? Do you think it is possible to regain those skills? And
I think absolutely. I mean, at least, in the study that I did with the studies that I did with early childhood boys and boys at adolescence, it really isn't about losing their relational capabilities. It's they learn to cover them up in what's very self-protective and actually socially adaptive. Because when you have people saying, "Hey, if you want social approval and acceptance, you need to be X, Y, and Z," then and they do it not because they're told they have to do it to be men. They do it because they want to connect with other people, and they find that this is what's going to help them do it. I mean, the tragedy is that when they adopt those behaviors, they actually make it so much more difficult to engage in any way that feels authentic with the people that they're trying to have relationships with. But I don't think, what I found, especially because I've seen evidence in older adolescents, I've read about research that finds this in adult men. It's Stuart Miller's book, as you might know, Men and Men's Friendship. Throughout their lives, men are still seeking, we continue, of all genders, to seek connections and resist disconnections throughout our lives. And so that is evidence of a healthy resistance against impositions that call for us that undermine our sense of integrity, that say you cannot remain connected to your own thoughts and feelings and desires, and that also hinder our relationships by making it harder for us to know and be known by other people. But the evidence of boys' healthy resistance shows that they continue, again, throughout the lifespan, to be interested and invested in being known for a version of themselves that feels authentic and whole, and so when they can find a space, and this is why some of the programmatic work that people are doing in communities is so important, is because they're creating spaces. Because you can't just say to an individual, "Oh, well, embrace this about yourself, go out and do it," if the world and their context, the peer group cultures are still hostile, or they're going to get policed, because that's just placing them in danger. And so but when leaders and educators and parents and entire societies work to kind of facilitate or create spaces that feel safe to them, that really welcome and genuinely value boys as whole people and men as whole people, then you see that emerge, and so I've seen it happen. I know Terry Real does work with this. I know a lot of people who create these wonderful spaces. November does this as well, create these wonderful spaces so that men and boys who people had kind of figured, they're just not interested, they're just not able to talk about it, they're able to do that when they perceive that this is something that's not going to lead to shame or emasculation or somehow, rejection and ridicule.
Mm. And you mentioned there, the role of parents, teachers, family members. I just wanted to, is there anything else you wanted to say about, how they can help boys to acknowledge rather than hide, these aspects of themselves?
Absolutely. Everyone in boys' lives has the potential to make an enormous difference. I mean, that there's this one study that was done in the U.S. by Michael Resnick, Dick Udry, and their whole an enormous team of researchers. It was a longitudinal study. They studied 90,000 people, and they found that the single best protector against psychological risk like depression, low self-esteem, and social risk like dropping out of school, using substances, unintended pregnancy, was having access to at least one close confiding relationship where they felt known and seen and supported. And that could be with anyone. It could be with a parent, a sibling, a teacher, a coach. But having that, the adolescents who had that protective relationship, that kind of protective relationship, were much better off. It's not that they didn't experience struggle or that they didn't face challenges. Of course they do, because that's inevitable in life, but that they were able to weather it better, that their resilience and their resistance was supported by those relationships. And of course, we know about role modeling, but also just the simple validation that somebody is willing to make that space and invite you to show up in the ways that feel comfortable and not, allow you to be fully present in the relationship. I mean, that has such a powerful impact on kids. And so even an individual parent, teacher, or anyone who is interacting with boys who can do that for them helps them to see how it's possible for them to be in the world and with other people. Because that's kind of one of the tasks of childhood and adolescence, right? Is boys or people of all genders actually are figuring out, how is it possible for me as a boy, as a, all the intersections of identity again, as who I am. How is it possible for me to be with other people and in the world? How can I contribute? What's acceptable? What's going to be desirable? Will people love me as I am? And so when they are shown that, yes, there's at least one person, then that encourages them to feel like, okay, I can do this and not be completely have to be on my own. I won't be rejected and cast out if I show somebody who I am. But the part of it is the reality that unfortunately not every space, not every person is safe in that way. And so I think that as boys grow up, one of the things that I observed with the 4-year-olds, for instance, was that they become savvy and selective. They become careful about what they reveal about themselves and to whom they reveal those things. And again, as long as they can have at least one person who says, yeah, that makes sense, or I get that, and, of course this is hard, or I see how you're struggling with this. I see you and you're fine. There's nothing wrong with you. We'll get through this together. Those are such powerful, it seems small, but it can be so powerful for children. If you ask older adolescents, like, what was it that enabled you to become and get to arrive at where you are now? Oftentimes it's these little things that I bet the person who said them doesn't remember saying. It wasn't like some sort of like, moment where they feel like this is the moment that my life changed. But, at least from the adult's point of view or the other person's point of view, but on the person who heard it, it made all the difference. And so coming back to your question about, what parents and teachers can do and the difference that they can make, I think they make a huge difference in these boys' lives. Because when they're in a world, especially now where kind of not so helpful messages can get really easily amplified, through social media and stuff, more than ever, boys need to hear, like, what do people really value in them, and what can people handle, them showing of themselves, like what they can reveal.
Right.
You've used some really interesting methods in your research, Judy, including with, as you've mentioned, with very young boys. So I was wondering if you could perhaps just tell us a bit more about your approach. Like, how do you go about conducting your research, generating these insights with boys and young men?
Oh, absolutely. And that actually links to something you had asked earlier about, Carol Gilligan, who was my advisor and supervised and guided my research. And one of the reasons why, given the history of psychological and developmental research and how it had focused primarily on boys and men, one of the questions that I often would receive is like, why do we need to study boys again if they were the bulk of, the research participants? And one of the things that had really drawn me was of what Carol and her colleagues developed called a voice-centered relational method. And that was this idea that we would learn from people about their experiences by focusing on their perspectives and by acknowledging that what they share with us about their lives is going to depend a lot on the relationship that we develop with them. So if they trust us, if they feel comfortable, that would make a difference. And of course, that's, when we think about it, of course, what people tell us about themselves is going to depend on what they think we're going to do with that information, whether we will, be able to sit with them in that space. And no one had really, it was really coming out of a time when that was more focused on kind of quantitative methods, which are not problematic in and of themselves. I definitely can, appreciate the value of certain questions being answered best by quantitative methods. But this idea, Carol's work really emphasized that you can learn about someone's inner world if they, by creating circumstances that enable them to convey their thoughts and feelings to you. And I was really interested to see like what would we learn about what boys are capable of knowing and doing in their relationships if we created circumstances that invited them to talk about their experiences without feeling like there was a right answer. Like what's going on with them, what's going on. And so that was kind of at the heart of it, was just kind of this attention to, if you develop a non-judgmental situation, if you create a trusting, non-judgmental space, what are you able to see? And so I used a lot of things from, for instance, ethnography and anthropology. So kind of going in as a participant observer, definitely starting out by just kind of getting a sense, looking to the boys as my informants, if you will, and kind of saying to them, I'm really interested to learn what's happening with boys. I myself, I've never been a boy, and so I'm looking to you as my teachers to kind of find out like what it's like, and that worked really well with the adolescent boys that I studied as well as with the young boys, and they kind of took me under their wing. They were very generous and very thoughtful, and sometimes they'd even say like, "Oh, Judy, you need to see this because if you want to know what it's like to be a boy, this is and so and they were. Both age groups were amazing, and that was part of actually what became my findings too. Was like I went in kind of having been grown up with certain stereotypes in my head about what boys wanted to talk about. Where a lot of my friends and colleagues would say, you're going in to talk to adolescent boys, like they're not going to want to talk to you. Why would they want to talk to you? And so I went in thinking nobody would want to talk to me, and was so pleasantly surprised when they were, again, really generous, really thoughtful, had a lot to say. And in fact, that was what actually led to my studying boys, was adolescent boys telling me, everyone's concerned about girls. We get it. We understand. And it's great that they want to support girls. But boys are going through things too. And nobody's talking to us. And then one boy said to me, you should study boys. You can start with me. And I kind of went, what? And when I went back and spoke to Carol, who is my advisor, she said, it sounds like he has something to say. Why don't you go back and hear him out? And so that's one of the things that when I present my work, and people say, oh, what do you recommend to adults who are trying to support boys' healthy development, who have boys' best interests at heart? What can you do? And I always say, like, nothing I did was extraordinary. It was really about the boys being able to tell you what they need and what they think and what's going on with them if they know that you're interested, that you're genuinely interested. So usually my first piece of advice is just listen, like start with listening. And if you can show them that you're not trying to judge them, you're not trying to blame them, criticize them, or somehow determine one thing or another, if you're just kind of there to learn from them. And I think that's kind of how some of the best relationships are. Like even people who are married for several years or best friends forever, at the end of the day, the most effective conversations, or the ones that people come away feeling good about, are usually when, the sense that that person, whether you've known them forever or just for a short time, really was curious and wanting to learn what's going on for you today, right now. Like, even if I've known you for 20 years, I'm interested in knowing what's happening with you today.
Yeah, I mean, can you think of any examples which really have stayed with you from your research? For example, of like where boys have been displaying some of the kind of resistance you talked about to some of these dominant masculine norms? Yeah, is there any examples which, really struck you?
Yeah, I mean, there were some really I think at the end of the day, like I said earlier, the resistance is they're healthy resistance against these, messages or pressures that just don't line up right with who they think they are, or how they experience themselves to be. That resistance, kind of comes in at least two forms. So one is a resistance against kind of betraying themselves, like saying like they feel fine when they don't actually feel fine, or that they like to do this when they don't like to do that, for the sake of, wanting to fit in. Or as one boy said, I think sometimes the boys as a group, they want to do this thing, and I don't really feel like that, but I don't want them to then target me if I decide to opt out. So there's like a resistance to like feeling like, not wanting to be compromised against their will. Now that's different from like compromise, like, oh yeah, that's okay with me, like, I want this kind of food today, you want that kind of food, we'll settle on a compromise. I mean, that's different because that's more intentional and by choice. It's more like feeling like they have no choice, or that someone else doesn't care what they want, they have to be this thing regardless, like you just do it. You could do it because you're supposed to, and you have no choice. That there's more of a feeling of resentment and discomfort around that. So there's that kind of resistance. what I guess to give a more specific example was like one of the boys had created a mean team that was, all of the boys were a member, and he said sometimes we're mean but sometimes we're not, but the boys group was called the mean team. And so sometimes they would actually go do mean things, like the girls had created a structure, and we went and knock it, and the boys decided they were going to go knock it down. And I said, oh, well, how do you feel about that? Is that is that okay with you? Is that something you want to do? And he goes, well, sometimes I don't feel like doing it, but I feel like I have to do it. Like I said, and the story was like, oh, or else they'll all get mad at me and they'll come after me and they'll do something mean to me. And so there's that kind of resistance. And then there's also the resistance of being excluded. So the two things that they're trying to preserve are their kind of connection to themselves, like their integrity, like this feels right to me, this doesn't feel right to me, I do or don't like or want to do this. And the other thing is a resistance to loss of connections to other people. So like if they're being excluded, there was a huge, it was interesting to me because I think an older boy would not do this, but when the younger boys, like if for some reason the boys were all playing together and they were trying to exclude this boy, that boy, instead of saying like, oh, kind of resigning to it, he would actually try that much harder to come back. And I always thought that was really admirable in some ways, like saying like, no, that's not acceptable to me. I want to be a part of this group. And so I'm going to find a way to be a part of this group, which if you compare it to like adolescence, I think there's more, it's harder because there's more of an embarrassment. There's more of a sense of shame. And so they'll go off and they'll kind of sit in their shame by themselves. And then maybe hopefully down the line they'll find kind of a way to come in or kind of connect with somebody else who isn't actively excluding them. But there's resistance there too. So I mean, in terms of the kinds of resistance, there's a resistance against disconnections from themselves and a resistance against disconnections from other people. So they're wanting to preserve their integrity and their relationships. And those were the kinds of examples I saw. But some things even as like every day, as like, you can't tell me what to do. You're not the boss of me, that kind of thing. Again, saying like, or one boy saying, he and his friend were arguing about what a particular cartoon picture was depicting, and then finally, and his friend kept insisting that that he was right, and so the original boy said, "Well, you may think that, but I don't." And so that kind of resistance. So it doesn't have to be like some, superhero kind of resistance, like they're fighting off bad guys or something. But it's just like these everyday compromises and kind of distinguishing between what am I comfortable giving up, which is no big deal. Like, oh, I wanted the blue one, but now I'm getting the green one, something like that. Or something like, they want me to do something that I don't like, and I'm not on board with that. And then trying to figure out, like, how do I make this choice? And so all these little tiny things that happen on a daily basis then feed into their sense of, again, how can I be in the world? What can I tell people? If I tell people I don't like this, are they going to immediately turn on me and they forget it, then I'm not your friend anymore? Or will they say, yeah, that's fine, and go on and find a way to? And that can be, again, to come back to Sandy's question earlier, where adults can really model and support kind of more resilient choices, like saying like, okay, that's okay, we can have differences, versus like, oh, if they're different, then we don't want to play with them anymore, or we don't like that person anymore. And so that's something where adults, especially, or even older siblings, are continually modeling for younger kids. I know that there's some dispute about like role modeling, but I really like the example that the Ms. Foundation in the US had a while ago, where there's a thing that they had developed called Take Your Daughters to Work Day, because they were trying to help girls see that women can be professionals, and they said that, and they were very proud of the fact that they had created something that actually the boys wanted, that the girls had that the boys wanted. So they said, well, how can we create something for boys? And one of the proposals was creating these buttons for men to wear that said, a boy is watching you. What is he learning about, like what it means to be a man, or how men treat women, or what men can express in terms of their emotions, or how men can show up in their relationship. I mean, there's a whole bunch of possibilities, but it's this idea that we are all role models. Kids are always watching us. They're learning what is possible, what is okay, and how they can be. And, the things we do matter. And so it's just this idea that, like, we have a lot of power to do good, and when we don't acknowledge and understand that power, we can inadvertently do harm, and so to be more, to be very intentional, because we, especially parents, for the first several years in your child's life, you are their superhero. You're the one that they're trying to figure out, that guides them through and provides an example of what it means to be an adult.
Something just connecting to what you were saying, something I found really powerful in your book was where you talk about how, in the process of being taught to kind of doubt and deny and hide these major parts of themselves, boys' own self-esteem and sense of self-worth can be significantly damaged. And that can then mean that then, kind of like you're saying, really, that then boys or young men, perhaps, or adult men may then lack the kind of confidence to actually challenge their peers if they are expressing things like sexism and misogyny, even when they do actually disagree with that. Do you want to say any more about that?
Yeah, well, that ties into a huge, again, kind of coming back to what we talked about, like in terms of socialization, and this, and Joseph Plec pointed out, a long time ago in 1981 in Myth of Masculinity, that these ideals of masculinity are ultimately unattainable. Like, and sociologist Irving Goffman pointed out, no one can be all of those things all of the time, right? No one can be tough, stoic, self-sufficient, always in control. Even, not just across ages, but even like in a single year of your life, across situations. Just nobody can be all those things. So inevitably, they will fall short. And so like this is just this idea that they're set up to, first of all, prove their masculinity, but to strive towards ideals, which by definition are ultimately unattainable, sets them up so that they will inevitably fall short and to experience shame and low self-esteem and anxiety and depression when they can't keep up that image. They can't, that masculine posturing is ultimately not sustainable, right? And it's also very precarious because, again, anyone at any time can challenge it. Like, oh, you're wearing pink, or oh, you cried at the funeral, or, sometimes it's outright ridiculous, some of the things that we seem to expect of boys and men, like, oh, they broke their arm and they're crying, and that's somehow not okay. Of course they're going to cry. They're human, and so they experience physical pain. They experience emotional pain. If they lose someone close to them, they're going to feel sad. But to be told that they're not supposed to feel it or show it, it just doesn't really make much sense. But it does, again, like when, especially for younger boys and men, when they're still trying to figure out like what's acceptable, what's normal, and they feel like they are personally flawed because they can't maintain that facade all the time. Your heart kind of just breaks for them, right? Because you just feel like that's so much pressure and it's such a burden to carry. And when they do, enter these spaces, like I said, there's really wonderful programming and community work where adult men oftentimes are really guiding them and showing them, like, look at this it's natural, it's normal. Vulnerability, that's a part of being human. And showing your vulnerability, that's courageous. It's not weak. It takes so much more to show that you're not okay all the time than it is to pretend like you are when you're not. And so, I think, but again, boys who haven't been let behind that curtain to see kind of the reality of what the human experience and the human condition is, they might be vulnerable or at risk for experiencing low self-esteem and damage because they feel like, one panel that I saw of adolescent boys, they were saying like, they're struggling, but they were taught to never show weakness, never reveal problems. And so he said he literally did not know how to ask for help. He knew he needed help, but he literally did not know how. He had never seen an example of it happening, and no one had ever taught him. So even though I say that the boys' relational capabilities, going back to the infant studies, this is an inherent capacity. They're born, just like we have the inherent capacity to learn language. We're born with a capacity, but if no one teaches us the language and we don't have room and opportunity to practice, we're not going to learn to speak, right? And we're not, and so like I think some of the more promising programs and curricula are giving boys not only permission to care and to express a range of emotions, but also the tools they need to really practice and develop and to master it so that they can be, so they can articulate the things that they're feeling. Because as, there's an American icon, Mr. Rogers, who says, if you can, what's mentionable is manageable. Right, and absolutely, and Mark Brackett at Yale talks about this too, permission to feel, like giving people language to express and put into words their, emotional intelligence is a very important thing for them to have if they're going to navigate life in ways that are more conducive to mental and physical well-being.
So, Judy, I'd be really interested to know a bit more about how you got involved in this area of research in the first place. I mean, you mentioned responding to a boy's intervention earlier in our conversation, but was your interest led by boys themselves, or was there something for you that was of interest before that?
Well, I think it has a lot to. Well, it has. It's twofold. I mean, one of them was that when I met Carol when I was a doctoral student, her work just really captured my attention and interest, because it was the first time that I had kind of learned about theories that I didn't have to figure out. It just made intuitive sense, right? And so a lot of what she was saying, it just felt so practical. It really resonated with what I knew from observations and my own experiences. And also just like I was saying with the method, it just made sense that, yeah, of course, the relationship between the researcher and participant, would matter, especially in qualitative, interviewing, and so a lot of these things were just like, it felt very effortless, like natural. And I was like, oh, well, this is what I want to do. I mean, I don't want to I've always admired, experiments that were very cleverly designed to kind of trick people into revealing what they thought. But I really love this idea that you can also trust people to tell you if you can create these conditions. And so I was really, really taken with her method, and also as well as with what her research had revealed, which was this idea, the whole ethic of care, that that it wasn't just about reason and logic, but that there's this other part of human ability that really taps into care and relationships, and that the relationships aren't just this kind of optional thing in our development that you can have, and it's great if you have it, but that relationships are actually central to human development, and that it's through and within relationships that we come to know ourselves, other people, and the world, that we develop our sense of who we are and what we're capable of, and all these things. And so it just made a lot of sense. And I was when I was reading about her findings about girls and how when they're socialized towards cultural constructions of gender, how they could sometimes come up against expectations that really didn't match what they wanted to be. And again, everyone has experienced this. Like, oh, when other people want you to be a certain way, but it doesn't match who you think you are, or the way that boys are said to be doesn't match how they experience themselves to be. Like, how do we reconcile those discrepancies? And what does it mean to choose one path as opposed to the other? Because in everything, there are gains and there are costs. And and we were seeing that, like, for instance, at adolescence, but I think throughout life, where social acceptance and belonging and all those things that we crave on a fundamental level are so important, that we might choose things that for the convenience or the pleasure, but we might, when we're forced to choose between self and relationships, I could see why we might choose relationships. But Carol also Carol's work also pointed out that when we choose relationships at the cost of ourselves, then who's in relationship, and how can, and are those real relationships? So I just thought that a lot of her questions were really relevant and really important, and that, and actually it was my husband who said, well, doesn't this apply to men too? I mean, men need relationships as well. Men also value relationships. It's also important to our development. It makes sense that this would be something. But again, the literature at the time had not really talked about relationships in that way. Again, it was really seen as a context for development, but that ultimately it was all about, it was very focused on the individual. And even the kind of like the goals of development were like, well, you strive towards individuation, separation, proving that you don't need anybody else, and that those were markers of maturity. And Carol's work really called that into question and said, like, what does socialization and development look like when we start with the understanding, as the infant studies show us, that we're born into relationships with a capacity and desire for relationships, and that we need those essential connections to ourselves and to other people in order to thrive. And these days, the research has since shown that it's also not just crucial to mental health and psychological well-being, but it's crucial to our physical well-being. And so there's just been, in the decades since I started studying it, so much kind of corroboration of the fact that, yes, relationships are more important than they were given credit for. And then what does it mean to kind of really incorporate that into the way that we live our lives? Because so much of our societal systems and structures are still designed as though we aren't all interrelated and connected, that somehow we can cut off a portion, some groups, or disenfranchise, certain populations and not feel impact and not be impacted by that. That doesn't make sense when we look from a relational model. And so that definitely drew me. And then the kind of spark that set it all off was that boy saying, come and interview me. Because I think, if anything, I felt a little shy. Like, I'm like, like I said, I was saying, like, people said, the adolescent boys wanted to talk to you. I mean, when I went into the school for boys, because I started out studying adolescent boys, because again, it was an adolescent boy, a 13-year-old who kind of challenged me and invited me to do it, to study boys. But, it was a school for 12 to 18-year-olds. And everyone was like, you'll be lucky if 5 or 10 boys talk to you. And so I just invited everyone and just to see like who would come. And I got more volunteers than I had time to interview. I ended up interviewing 58 people because I didn't leave enough time, because I thought I would only get 5 or 10. But I ended up doing, almost 60 interviews in the short amount of time that I had set aside to do interviews, because they had something to say. And I had, like I said, before I did the interviews with both ages, I started out with just participant observations, hanging out in the halls, letting them ask me why I was there. One teacher even said, I can't believe you're getting credit at Harvard for hanging out in the hallway and observing boys. And I said, yeah, apparently it's a thing. And so, but they, the boys could kind of ask me, like, what are you studying? Why are you here? What are you trying to learn? And when I asked for volunteers, they said, well, yeah, I can tell you about this. And like I said, they were wonderful, and they were thoughtful, and they had a lot of really rich stories about what it's like and what they're thinking about and what they're trying to figure out.
Yeah. I mean, you reminded me when you're talking about some research in the UK. I think it was called Young Masculinities by Frosch and Patman and Phoenix.
Yes, I read
and they also said, given the right conditions, boys are perfectly happy to talk. They want to talk. I think their thing also was, in a group they might present differently from how they would on their own. But that certainly backs up what you're saying. But I was thinking also about, in your own book, you talk a bit about your relationship with your own son, don't you? And I'm wondering about the sort of interconnection between your parenting and your research. But you may or may not want to talk about that, of course. But
no, it was.
How are they connected?
Well, my son definitely grew up with while I was working on my book, which took a lot longer to write, because I thought, being a new parent, I was like, yeah, I'll just write the book when he's napping. And of course, the reality of parenting hit me like was not what I had imagined. And so it took a lot longer. But actually, it was really helpful for me, because I found that as a parent, it's so easy to doubt yourself. It's so easy to worry about whether you're doing what's right and best for your kid. I mean, every night, when the minute my head hits the pillow, I'm thinking, oh, I shouldn't have said this. I shouldn't have done this. I should have done this instead. And so I definitely can, relate to parents wanting what's best for their kids, worrying about the choices that they're making and the repercussions that will have. And it was actually really helpful for me to be focusing on, to be reminded by what the boys and their parents had taught me of what it kind of provided a compass in many ways. And then when I checked in with Carol, because she's been supportive throughout, ever since I met her, we continue to stay in touch. And she was like, what's true from what you learn from the boys. And so when you start to get sucked into, all of the noise about, boys are like this, boys are like that, she's like, you have the privilege of having heard from boys themselves and learned from boys themselves what they are like and what they're capable of, and you can trust. So I wasn't left to just trust my instincts. I actually had data to say, no, this is true, and it's going to be okay. And even though people are saying, shyness in boys is a problem, I'm like, actually, it's not a problem, and I could kind of feel like I feel like someone had my back, that it wasn't me standing alone saying, no, I think boys really have feelings. I think it's okay if they feel these things. And also like the boys' fathers were their advice, because I transcribed those meetings and I'd listened to what they were saying, was so helpful, because it showed me that we're playing the long game, right? And so you might mess up in this instance, but these relationships, they're resilient. And one of the fathers especially really demonstrated over and over again that your kids don't need you to be perfect. In fact, they don't. It's not helpful if you act like you are, because what they need from you, and he shared so many wonderful stories about this, was like, they need to see you mess up sometimes and own up to it and kind of figure out what to do when you mess up and how can you keep learning. And it's through those imperfections that it gives them permission to be imperfect, but then also gives them inspiration to strive towards like, oh, okay, this is how I can do it. It's not about control and about presenting this picture perfect image to the world, but it's really about figuring it out together and knowing that we're all in this together instead of alone, trying to prove something to someone that doesn't even care about us, this idea again of proving masculinity, but to whom? And so if we can, that was helpful for me, because again, as someone who grew up playing by the rules and thinking it was important to meet every societal expectation and to present in the ways that people expected me to, this research really helped to kind of validate my own doubts and my own questions, but at the same time affirm the fact that I knew something about at least myself and my son. Nobody knows our kids better than we do, right? And nobody has the opportunity to be there for them in the ways that we can, if we happen to have access to them and see them on a daily basis. And so we can be really positive influences, not perfect influences, but present and positive
And given all you've said about the importance of relationships and connection, particularly to boys, how do you feel about sort of more contemporary development of the manosphere and how young men are being drawn into it and also into far right politics? What should we be doing to draw them away from these things without perpetuating a sense of, opposition between women and men, or notions that boys are somehow under attack or victims of feminism?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it's a big discussion. We could easily talk for hours about it, but at the risk of oversimplifying it, I think what we can do in a nutshell is offer alternatives, because they're going there or they're finding their way there because they have questions that are real questions and absolutely appropriate, age-appropriate questions. Like, again, they go in because, how do you make yourself attractive? How do you have friends? How do you attract a mate? How do you how do you succeed? How do you get other people to see you as successful? How do you derive? All these questions are questions that are normal and that everyone has, right? But the thing is, I think if I can give an example, there's this thing at Stanford. They have a policy like any party that offers alcohol has to offer an ENAB, and ENAB stands for equally attractive non-alcoholic beverage. So if you're going to have a party, in addition to beer or whatever is there, you have to have not just water. You can't say either have beer or you can have water. You had to have something like a fruity spritz or whatever soda. And so I think what we can do is we can offer boys ENABs. And one of the things that they really want, again, as all humans want, is they want a connection. They want time and face-to-face time with real people, with real interactions. And I feel like it's so easy, and I get it because adults are addicted to their phones and screens too. It's really tempting. It's so easy to kind of have our eyes and our brains sucked into the constant barrage of entertainment that is available online. But kids, you'll see this in kids, and that's one thing I have observed, in everywhere that I've traveled. Kids and also, adults, they're trying to get your attention. If you would look away from your phone, they much prefer having you, when Sean, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting his name. He's based in Australia, and I met him at the Fathering Summit a couple months ago. But he said, you are your child's favorite toy. And I loved that because I'm like, I think that can be applied to other ages as well. At the end of the day, we want someone else's attention, and there's really no substitute for that. And I think that if a simple, practical thing that parents can do to draw their kids away from influences that they might not be helping them is to offer them, let's go outside, let's take a trip, let's have a talk, let's go for a walk. The kids will most likely, like you're saying with Frosh and Pat, they'll take you up on it. If you show an interest in a person and you're really curious about how they're doing and what's going on with them, most people most of the time will take you up on that offer. They absolutely want that. That's what real memories are made of. I always tell my son, I'm like, you're not going to think back like, oh, remember that time the five of us were sitting around and we were all on our phones? That's not going to be a memory for you. You're going to remember like the impact of having an exchange and feeling something transpire, something meaningful. It doesn't have to be like this life-shattering, huge moment, but it's just being with other people. As one of the 12-year-old boys that I interviewed said, that feeling that someone else understands and can relate, whether it's a positive experience or a negative experience, it just kind of comforts. And I think that captures it really well. Just knowing we're not alone in experiencing the many things that we're experiencing. We all crave that kind of connection. It's a powerful and healing connection. And I think that one of the reasons I'm not super fond of screens is I feel like it takes it away. It takes away from that. I'm not saying to throw away your screens. I get that they're useful, but I'm just saying that we need to balance a better balance. And so that's one simple thing people can do to say, offer them an ENAB. The Manosphere is out there. But you know what? Previously, there was television, there was video, and things have always been out there. I say that Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, was very prescient, right? And we basically have a more extreme and intense version of that. But when you invite externally creative media into your home, it's like inviting a stranger into your children's lives, and we would watch that. We would be careful, we would be more careful, and I think we can. I'm not saying it's easy, it's everywhere, so it feels very challenging, but again, from what I've heard from boys themselves and men and people of all genders and ages, they want to connect, and when we offer them those opportunities, they take us up on that.
Yeah. Well, I'm very grateful that you've, come onto our podcast and held our attention for all this time. It was just really interesting to hear you talking about your work. So I'm very, very grateful. And I'm sure Steve is too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just thinking, I'm not surprised that the boys wanted to talk to you because you're very easy and pleasant to talk to. So so thank you so much for doing your work and coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions and for your very kind responses and for your patience with me, because I know I get very excited about this work because I just think these boys have something really wonderful to share, and I just hope that they get the opportunity to show people all that they're capable of, because I think that they really get kind of shortchanged a lot of times in how they're represented. And when we can listen and lean in, we see a lot of wonderful things, and it gives a lot of reasons to have hope.
Absolutely. Thank you, Judy.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So I loved listening to Judy talking about her work there, particularly the importance of human relations and the depth and complexity of those, and how those apply to boys and men as well as women and girls, that were not, she didn't say this, but it occurred to me whilst we were talking, we're not, as men, just Robinson Crusoe sitting on an island. We're not part of the Lord of the Flies world, Golding's work, where boys are just abusing each other through the hierarchies. I mean, it's great to hear a positive picture about how boys are, how they can be, and what the influences on them are. So, what did you think, Stephen?
No, I totally agree. It was very, very powerful. And I must confess, on a personal level, I was hugely impacted by the work of Carol Gilligan, who Judy mentioned. And then that led me to read Judy's book. And I was so touched by it. And I actually think, it just really resonates with my own experience, really, because, I feel like when I was a young boy, I think I was always very sensitive. And I remember that my closest friends were girls when I was, very young. But then I do remember at a certain age, I start to have that girls are seen as gross, and that you're not allowed to have those mixed gender friendships anymore. And I can really relate to having to, push down many parts of yourself. Yeah.
She mentions in some of her work the difference between, I think it's explicit and implicit resistance to, masculine norms, and the implicit is about what you just do without really thinking about it, and the explicit is you say stuff about what you're happy or unhappy with. I mean, does that resonate for you?
It does, yes. I mean, I think, as I said, I think in some ways I would have been engaging in implicit resistance because these norms felt so unnatural to me, and like I was having to really fit into something that that just didn't feel right or feel comfortable. But then on the other hand, I probably didn't resist as much as I would have liked, really. On a, certainly in that more explicit way. Yes, maybe, privately, I just kept alive that more sensitive part of myself. But I guess I wish I would have, spoken more explicitly about it as well. I think probably as I became a teenager, in some ways, I guess I was lucky. I, had parents who were very loving and who maybe encouraged those like outspoken, more rebellious sides of myself to be expressed. So maybe I started to do that more as a teenager. But I think also probably I was quite good at understanding, okay, what do I have to do to fit in, even if actually I'm not fully comfortable with that. What about you?
Yeah, that point you just made there about, working out how to fit in, if you're kind of good at football or something, then you're part of the in crowd, and so I definitely remember that. But the issue about resistance, I mean, the example that I can think of is, I went to an all-boys school which had a cadet force. I've probably mentioned this in the podcast before, but at a certain point you could make choices about your engagement. You had to do 2 compulsory years. And in year 1, I think I learned how to kill people, how to shoot people. And year 2, I thought, well, I don't really want to do any more of that, And so I went for what was called first aid and light rescue, because I thought, well, at least knowing first aid might be of some use, in terms of caring for others. So I did that, and that was a sort of conscious choice. But I don't remember going around saying to other boys, young men, don't go down the militaristic route. So in a way, it was implicit resistance.
I was thinking about the important role we as men can play in showing boys, that kind of resistance is possible and good, and that these parts of ourselves are actually really important and valuable, and we need them and we should express them. Because I was thinking as well, like, is there a risk that, I certainly don't think the idea here is that we responsibilize women for this, right? Because if you think back to the episode with Angelica Ferrara, I think that often is what happens, isn't it? Is that if men are going to express these sides of themselves anywhere, it probably is in relationships with women, because maybe those are the only spaces where they feel comfortable to do so. And on the flip side, maybe there's a risk that we blame mothers, right? For like, mothers aren't raising their sons, effectively because, maybe they're not helping them to develop these skills or express them enough. So I think it really shows, doesn't it, the need for us as men to play a more active role in showing boys and helping boys, to express these relational parts of ourselves.
But it was interesting that quite a lot of what she was talking about was very much on the sort of day-to-day micro level between individuals, wasn't it? And I mean,
Yes.
clearly there's probably quite a lot more that could be said about how, one can provide the conditions where those interactions can be effective. So, for instance, in school, what would be a whole school approach to relationships and, education and so on. I mean, I know there are schools that do think about these things, but when I think back to my own experience, I went to what was quite an academic school, and results was the thing that mattered. And I don't really think, and I felt this at the time, that relationships was really valued, if I'm honest. It was all for the greater good of the school.
What's interesting is that because I feel like at primary school level, maybe there is more of that celebration of kindness and compassion and care. And then as you get to secondary school, it becomes a bit different to that. But although even at primary school, I think there can still be that kind of competitiveness being encouraged. And I was thinking as well in terms of culture, how can we offer a wider spectrum to boys through our culture, because I think so much of what they watch, for example, on film and TV, is very much about that independent, self-reliant, competitive self. But also, just because Judy mentioned Mr. Rogers, who I think people in the UK might not necessarily be familiar with, but I think he had this very big children's TV show in the US. The only reason I know this is because there's a film about him called A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. It stars Tom Hanks, and it's a very lovely, powerful film. And I think he was somebody who, in the mainstream culture, was offering a really kind, gentle, caring man. I guess in the UK, somebody like David Attenborough, perhaps. It's interesting that it's often older men, isn't it? You don't really, see younger men. You don't see examples of that in the culture necessarily, but yeah.
Yeah, I suppose there was a couple of questions which I, on reflection, think it would have been interesting to ask, but didn't get a chance to. One was about, the whole notion of masculine norms. I mean, we often sort of frame those as if they're always negative, and I don't know whether that's true. You could say that there are some norms like taking responsibility or respect for others, which could be considered to be part of masculine norms. And so I would have been interested to hear what she had to say about that. And the other issue was about how being gay or non-binary might fit into her analysis. Because we didn't really talk about that, and I'm sure she would have had lots to say about it. But
I think those are such good points, and it makes me think about our discussion with Finn Mackay, for example. About about if positive masculinity is the thing we should be kind of proposing or offering to boys and men, because actually I think what Judy said on that was very powerful, wasn't it? That it's not about simply trying to replace something we associate with masculinity with something we associate with femininity. It's actually just opening up the whole thing, isn't it? And just allowing all of us to express all parts of ourselves as honestly and authentically as possible, regardless of whether that's associated. Well, it just shouldn't be associated with one gender or the other, should it? These are all just human qualities which we all have in our own varied, interesting, distinct ways. Yeah.
Yes, that's probably enough from us, though, isn't it, Stephen?
It probably is. Probably is for one day. Yes.
Talk for 10 minutes or so.
Oh, gosh, yes. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Sandy. And yes, I'm very pleased to be able to have a relationship with you.
Oh. I noticed you called me on LinkedIn. You called me delightful recently, which I was very impressed by that.
It's an understatement.
I'll have to think of an adjective for you soon.
Very good. Well, and thank you to our delightful listeners as well. And please do get in touch with us at nowandmen@gmail.com if you want to relate with us in any way. And do subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already, and we'll be back soon.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Goodbye.